"I'm leaving in April," Clara said. "Nothing you do is going to change that." Nathaniel Carter looked at her across the kitchen table at the woman who had spent 3 months fighting for his land, his neighbors, his future, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and set something on the table between them. A ring. Plain gold. Honest. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay for the land. I'm not asking because you owe me anything." His voice dropped to the quiet of a man who had stopped pretending. "I'm asking because you're the only place I've ever wanted to come home to." If this cowboy's words just stopped your heart, subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the last word, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Clara Whitmore had not cried when she packed her bags in Missouri. She had not cried when she sold her father's pocket watch to pay for the stage fare. She had not cried when she climbed aboard the rattling coach and watched the only town she had ever known shrink smaller and smaller through the smeared back window until it disappeared entirely behind a curtain of red dust. She told herself there was nothing left to cry for. The dead couldn't be brought back. The debts couldn't be unwished. And the future, whatever cold, uncertain shape it would take, waited somewhere ahead of her, not behind. Clara was 25 years old. And she had learned one thing above all else in those 25 years: the women who survived were the ones who kept moving. So she moved. Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1887 was not what the dime novels described. There were no golden sunsets that lasted forever. No brave heroes silhouetted on horseback against a sky painted red and purple and magnificent. What Clara found when the stage finally rolled into Harlan Creek was a single dirt road cutting between 2 rows of buildings that looked like they were arguing with the wind about whether to stay standing. A dry goods store, a feed barn, a small schoolhouse that leaned slightly to the left like a tired man who'd stopped trying, a church with a bell but no steeple, and a saloon that was doing considerably better business than the church. The stage driver handed her down with all the ceremony of unloading a sack of flour. "Harlan Creek," he announced. Clara looked at the town. The town looked back at her, or rather, the 12 people currently visible on the street looked back at her. Some with curiosity, some with the flat, practiced indifference of people who had seen too many newcomers pass through to waste interest on another one. She picked up her bag and walked toward the schoolhouse. She had a job. That was enough. That was everything. The schoolhouse belonged to a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who was 71 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and possessed of a personality that suggested she had never in her life encountered a problem she could not solve by talking at it firmly until it gave up. Agnes had written the letter that brought Clara west. "We need a school teacher." The last one left after 8 months. The one before lasted 4. "We are not a difficult town, Miss Whitmore. We are simply a frontier town, and frontier towns require a particular kind of woman. Room and board provided. Salary modest but reliable. Position available immediately." Clara had written back within 2 days. She had not written because she burned with passion for frontier education. She had written because the bank in Missouri had sent a 3rd notice about her father's debts, and the only job she'd been offered in Springfield was scrubbing floors at the hotel where she used to eat Sunday dinners. Pride, she had decided, was a luxury. Survival was the point. Agnes met her at the schoolhouse door and looked her over. The way a woman looks at a horse she's considering buying, thorough, unsentimental, and completely without apology. "You're younger than I expected," Agnes said. "The letter didn't specify an age requirement," Clara said. Agnes smiled. It was the kind of smile that meant she had already decided something. "No," she said. "It didn't. Come in. I'll show you the room." The room was small. The bed was adequate. The window looked out over the back fence and beyond that open land stretching so far in every direction that it made Clara feel simultaneously free and completely alone. She set her bag down. "How long is the school term?" she asked. "September through April," Agnes said. 7 months. "And after April?" Agnes studied her with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Most teachers go home for the summer." "I'll be leaving in April," Clara said. Not going home, leaving, because she didn't have a home anymore, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said simply, "All right then." Neither of them mentioned it again. Clara had been in Harlan Creek exactly 3 days before she met Nathaniel Carter. She had not sought the meeting. She had in fact been actively engaged in the business of not meeting anyone beyond what the job required. She had introduced herself to the families with school-age children. She had purchased her basic supplies from the dry goods store. She had exchanged the minimum of pleasantries with the neighbors near the schoolhouse. That was sufficient. That was the plan. The plan dissolved on a Thursday morning when she walked out of the dry goods store, carrying a bag of flour and a bottle of ink, and stepped directly into a situation she had not asked to be part of. 3 men on horseback had stopped in the middle of the road. The man in the center, broad-shouldered trail dusty, with a jaw that could have been carved out of the same hard red earth under his horse's hooves, was speaking to a 4th man who stood on the ground beside a wagon. The man on the ground was older. His hat was in his hands, turning and turning in a gesture that made Clara's chest ache before she even heard the words. 2 more weeks, the older man was saying. "That's all I'm asking, Nate. 2 more weeks. The south pasture'll be ready and I can—" Harold. The man on horseback. Nate, his voice was not unkind, but it was final. "I'm not the bank. I can't wait on the bank's timeline." "I know that. I know it." Harold's hands worked the hat brim harder. "But I've got 3 kids, and the well ran dry on the east side, and my wife's been sick, and I need a little more time." Silence. Clara stood very still outside the dry goods store door and watched the man on horseback look at the older man on the ground. She expected refusal. She had seen enough of the world to expect refusal. Creditors didn't grant extensions out of the goodness of their hearts. That was simply how things worked. Nate Carter looked at Harold for a long moment. Then he looked at the 2 men riding with him. They exchanged a glance that meant something. Some private communication that Clara couldn't decode. 2 weeks, Nate said. Not a day more. Harold exhaled. His whole body exhaled. "Thank you, Nate. I swear to you." "Don't swear. Just get the south pasture done." Nate turned his horse. His eyes, passing across the street, landed on Clara for exactly 1 second. She looked back. He looked away first. She asked Agnes about him that evening. "Nathaniel Carter," Agnes said, handing Clara a cup of coffee and settling into the chair across the small kitchen table. "Owns the Carter Ranch, about 6 miles north of town. Been there since he was 19 when his father passed and left him with a piece of land and more debt than cattle. He seemed—" Clara searched for the word. "Deliberate." Agnes's mouth curved slightly. "That's one word." "What's another?" "Closed," Agnes said. "Careful. The kind of man who's been disappointed enough times that he learned to stop expecting much." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "He had a partner once, fellow named Douglas Marsh. They built the ranch together for nearly 3 years. Then Marsh forged Nate's signature on a land transfer, took a section of the best grazing acreage, and sold it to a man in Cheyenne before Nate even knew it happened." Clara set her cup down slowly. "What happened?" "Nate took him to court, spent every dollar he had, won back half the land." Agnes paused. "Lost most of the people who'd worked for him in the process, because Marsh had spent those 3 years telling everyone that Nate was impossible to work with. Hard, cold, unreasonable." "Was he—" Agnes looked at her steadily. "People who've been betrayed tend to look cold to people who've never had to be." Clara said nothing. She thought about the older man in the road with the hat turning in his hands. 2 weeks, not a day more. Said without cruelty and without sentimentality. Said like a man who understood exactly what it meant to need more time than you had. "He'll be fine," Agnes said, reading something in her silence. "Nate always manages." "I wasn't worried," Clara said. Agnes smiled into her coffee. "Of course not." The school opened on the first Monday of September, with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Clara had taught before 2 years at a primary school in Springfield before her father's health declined and she'd come home to care for him. She knew how to manage a classroom. She knew how to hold a child's attention, how to make letters and numbers feel like something worth understanding, rather than obstacles placed between mourning and freedom. What she had not anticipated was how much she would like these particular children. There was Rosie Greer, 9 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, who raised her hand every single time Clara asked a question, regardless of whether she knew the answer. There was James Falconer, 12, who read at a level that suggested someone somewhere had cared very much about his education at some point. There was little May Pruitt, Agnes's grandniece, who was 6 and small, and watched everything with enormous brown eyes that cataloged the world with perfect seriousness. And there was Thomas Carter. He was 8 years old, and he had his uncle's jaw. She didn't know he was Nate's nephew for the first 2 weeks. He was simply Thomas, quiet, watchful, quick at arithmetic, slow to trust. He sat in the second row and did his work and never caused trouble and never quite relaxed either. He watched the door sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking with the particular attention of a child who has learned that things can change very quickly. She learned he was Nate's nephew when Nate appeared at the schoolhouse door on a Friday afternoon in late September. The children had gone home. Clara was at the board erasing the arithmetic problems from the day's lesson. She heard the door and turned. He filled the frame in a way that was simply physical fact, not intimidation. The width of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself like a man accustomed to being the largest thing in any space he occupied. His hat was in his hand. His expression was the same deliberate neutrality she'd seen in the road that first day. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carter." A pause. He looked past her to where Thomas had been sitting all day. "How is he doing?" Clara considered the question seriously, the way she would have wanted her own teachers to consider it. "He's sharp. He catches things quickly. He's careful sometimes, too careful. He thinks about whether something is worth saying before he says it." Something moved through Nate Carter's expression. There and gone. "He gets that from his father," Nate said. "My brother." "Where is his father?" The neutrality returned solid as a wall. "Not here." Clara waited. She had learned in her 2 years of teaching that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was simply not fill the silence. Nate turned his hat once in his hands. "His mother passed 3 years ago. Tom's been with me since." "He's doing well," Clara said again. "He works harder than most children twice his age." Something released in Nate Carter's face. Not a smile, not quite. More like a breath let out slowly. "Good. That's good." He nodded once, a gesture that was clearly intended as a farewell, and turned to go. "Mr. Carter." He stopped. "He watches the door sometimes," Clara said carefully. "In the afternoon, about an hour before school ends." A pause. "That's when I usually pick him up." "He's watching to make sure you're coming," Clara said. Not an accusation, just the truth offered plainly. Nate turned slowly and looked at her over his shoulder. His eyes were darker than she'd expected up close, darker and much more complicated. "He knows I'm coming," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "But he watches anyway." Another silence. Longer. "I'll be early from now on," Nate said. He was. October arrived and the temperature dropped and the character of Harlan Creek shifted, tightened the way places tighten, when winter is still weeks away, but already making itself known in the quality of the light and the bite at the edges of the wind. Clara tightened too. She had been in Harlan Creek for 2 months. She had $43 saved. By April, she would have at minimum enough for the train fare east and 2 months' living expenses while she found another position. 2 months of living expenses. The penciled number at the bottom of her small leather account book. She kept the book in her coat pocket close like a compass. One evening, she was walking back from the post office. She'd sent a letter to a school in Cincinnati that had advertised for a fall teacher when she heard a commotion coming from the direction of the feed barn. She heard it before she saw it. Raised voices, the particular sharp pitch of an argument that had gone past the point of solving itself politely. She rounded the corner and found 2 men squared off in the space outside the barn door. One of them she recognized Ed Haller, who ran the feed barn and had twin boys in her classroom. The other man she did not know, younger than Haller, dressed in town clothes that hadn't seen trail dust, with the particular ease of a man who was accustomed to things going his way. Between them on the ground was a scattered mess of papers. "Those are my records," Haller was saying. His voice was shaking with a specific quality that Clara recognized, the shaking of a man who was furious because he was frightened. "You have no right." "I have every right," the other man said pleasantly. "Your account is in arrears by 4 months. The company has legal authority to review your business records." "I've been making payments, partial payments," the man said, still pleasant, still utterly certain. "Partial payments do not satisfy the contract, Mr. Haller. I've explained this." "Then explain it to Nate Carter," Haller said. "He'll tell you." "Mr. Carter doesn't own your debt," the man said. "I do." Clara stopped walking. She was not part of this. She told herself clearly that she was not part of this. She was a schoolteacher who was leaving in April, and this was a business dispute between men she barely knew, and she had her own problems, her own penciled number at the bottom of her account book, her own letter waiting in Cincinnati. She kept walking. She had gone exactly 4 steps past the mouth of the alley when she stopped. On the ground between the scattered papers and Haller's boots, she could see a child's drawing. A rough penciled sketch of a barn and 2 stick figures that might have been people or might have been fence posts, but was clearly precious to someone because it had been folded and refolded until the creases were worn soft. Haller's twins were in her class. Haller himself had brought a dish to the school supper 2 weeks ago and washed it himself afterward because his wife was down with a cold and he hadn't wanted to burden anyone. Clara turned around. She walked back to the alley mouth. "Excuse me," she said. Both men looked at her. "Those papers are on the ground," she said, addressing the man in town clothes directly. "In the dirt. If they are legal documents, they should not be on the ground in the dirt." The man in town clothes looked at her with the particular look men give women who have said something inconvenient. Patient. Faintly amused. Waiting for her to realize she had made an error. "This is a private business matter, ma'am," he said. "Then conduct it privately," Clara said. "Not in the street in front of the feed barn." Haller was staring at her. Something in his face had shifted, not quite hope, but the direction hope would come from if it arrived. The man in town clothes looked at her for a moment longer. Then slowly, he picked up the papers from the ground. He straightened them. He looked at her one more time with an expression that was still pleasant and completely unreadable. "Good evening," he said. He walked away. Haller let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below his boots. He bent and picked up the child's drawing, folded it again carefully, and put it in his breast pocket. "Thank you," he said to Clara. "I don't thank you." "Who is that man?" Clara asked. "Name's Connolly," Haller said. "Works for a company out of Cheyenne. They've been buying up debt in this county for the past year." He looked down the road where Connolly had disappeared. "Getting a lot of it, too." She mentioned Connolly to Agnes that evening. Agnes went quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Careful. "Daniel Connolly," Agnes said. "He's been in and out of the territory for 8 months. Bought up 3 farming debts last spring. 2 of those families lost their land by summer." "Legally?" Clara asked. "Everything he does is legal," Agnes said. "That's what makes it so hard to fight." Clara thought about this. She thought about Haller's face and the child's drawing in the dirt, and the way Connolly had smiled the whole time. "Is he after Carter's ranch?" Agnes looked at her. "What makes you ask that?" "Because the ranch is the biggest operation near town," Clara said. "And because men who buy debt tend to buy it in one direction." Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I know Nate's had a rough year. Lost 2 cattle contracts. Had fence damage on the north section from a storm in July." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He's not broken, but he's been better." Clara said nothing. She thought about the number at the bottom of her account book. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought against her will about a man who had told a frightened older man 2 weeks with all the weariness of someone who knew exactly what it cost and chose to pay it anyway. She told herself it was not her business. She went to bed. She lay awake longer than she wanted to. The following Tuesday, Nate Carter arrived to pick up Thomas from school early, as he had been since their conversation, and found Clara standing outside the schoolhouse door in the specific posture of a woman who has decided to say something she has not yet fully worked out the right words for. He slowed. He stopped. He looked at her with those complicated dark eyes. "I saw Daniel Connolly in town last week," Clara said. "I know who he is," Nate said. "I was going through Ed Haller's business records in the street." Something hardened in Nate's jaw. "Ed told me. Is he going to do the same to you?" The silence that followed was different from Nate Carter's ordinary silences. This one had weight and texture, and a careful quality that told her the answer was yes, but the yes was complicated. "He can try," Nate said. "That's not an answer." His eyes moved to her face. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the schoolhouse, with the same careful assessment she recognized from the road that first day. But something else underneath it now. Something that hadn't been there before. "Why are you asking?" he said. It was a fair question. She was a schoolteacher who was leaving in April. Connolly was not her problem. Nate Carter's finances were not her problem. "Because I keep a very good record," Clara said. "Financial records, receipts, dates, payment histories. I kept my father's accounts for 7 years before he died, and I know what legal financial manipulation looks like up close." She paused. "If Connolly is coming after people in this town, documentation is the only thing that stops him." Nate was very still. "Why are you telling me this?" he said, quieter. "Because someone has to," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression. Something slow and private, like a door somewhere deep in a house opening just an inch. Thomas appeared in the schoolhouse doorway behind Clara, his coat already buttoned, his school bag on his shoulder, watching his uncle with the same particular attention he brought to everything. "Uncle Nate," he said. "Hey, Tom." Nate's voice changed completely when he spoke to the boy. The wariness dropped out of it, and something else came through, simple, unguarded, and undeniable. "Good day," Thomas considered. "Miss Whitmore says I'm good at fractions." "She's right," Nate said. He looked at Clara over the boy's head. "I'll think about what you said." "That's all I asked," Clara said. He nodded. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder, a brief warm gesture, unconscious and complete, and they walked toward the road together, the man and the boy, their boots making the same sound on the packed earth, moving in the same quiet, self-contained rhythm. Clara watched them go. She put her hand in her coat pocket and touched the leather account book. Cincinnati, she thought. She did not think it with quite the conviction she had managed the day before. That night, something woke her. Not a sound exactly. More the absence of the right sounds, the particular quality of the dark outside her window that said something was different. She got up and went to the window. The street below was empty. The town was asleep. The sky above Harlan Creek was enormous and clear, and absolutely crowded with stars, the way the Missouri sky never was, so many of them that they stopped being beautiful and started being something more like overwhelming. A reminder of how much space existed and how small a single human life was inside all of it. Clara pressed her forehead to the glass. She thought about her father. Not the sick man at the end, but the earlier version, the one who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping on a Saturday morning when she was 9 years old, who had said, "Clara, the thing about numbers is they don't lie. People lie. Numbers just show you what happened." She thought about Connolly's smile. She thought about 3 families who had lost their land by summer. She thought about Nate Carter putting his hand on a small boy's shoulder in a gesture so natural it looked like breathing. She went back to bed. She did not open the account book. But she knew, in the way you know things before you're ready to admit them, that something in the careful penciled arithmetic of her plan had already begun to change. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her, or what she was going to find on the other side of the price. She lay in the dark and listened to Wyoming breathe around her, vast, indifferent, demanding, and alive, and tried very hard not to feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She almost succeeded. The next morning, Clara found her wagon wheel broken. Not cracked. Not loose. Broken clean through the wood split at the hub in a way that said it had been weakening for a while and had finally made its decision overnight while she was lying awake, thinking about things that were none of her business. She stood in the cold morning air, looking at it for a long moment. The wagon wasn't hers. It came with the teaching position. Agnes had arranged it so Clara could get supplies from the dry goods store without walking half a mile in winter mud. It was old, and it was rickety, and apparently it was also now useless. She went inside and told Agnes. Agnes looked at the wagon, looked at the wheel and said, in the voice of a woman performing a rapid calculation. "I can walk for supplies," Clara said. "In January you can't," Agnes said. "Not in this weather. Not with what we need." "Then I'll arrange something else." "I'll send word to Nate Carter," Agnes said. "He's got a spare wheel and the tools to fit it." Clara opened her mouth. Agnes looked at her. Clara closed her mouth. The message went out with the Pruitt boy who ran errands on Tuesday mornings. By early afternoon, Nate Carter's truck wagon was visible through the schoolhouse window coming down the road from the north. Clara knew it was his before she could see his face because Thomas pointed and said quietly to the boy sitting beside him, "That's my uncle." He said it the way children say things they are proud of, but have decided not to make a big display about. Clara kept her eyes on the arithmetic problem she had written on the board. She heard boots on the She heard Agnes's voice low and warm in the way it was only with people she genuinely liked. She heard the creak of the back gate. She did not go out. She told herself she was in the middle of a lesson. She got through 18 minutes before Rosie Greer raised her hand and said, "Miss Whitmore, there's a man fixing the wagon outside." "I know," Clara said. "He's really big," Rosie offered. "Thank you, Rosie. Eyes on your work." She lasted another 11 minutes. Then she sent the children to their reading, pulled on her coat, and walked outside, because standing in the schoolroom, pretending she couldn't hear the sounds of someone working 12 feet from her window, was starting to feel more ridiculous than whatever conversation waited outside. Nate was crouched beside the wagon, with the kind of focused total attention that men give to mechanical problems when they are trying very hard not to think about something else. He had the broken wheel off and the new one propped against his knee. His hands moved with the ease of someone who had done this specific task 100 times. He did not look up when she came out. "You didn't have to come yourself," Clara said. "No one else was going," he said. "You could have sent someone from the ranch." "I was coming to town anyway." She was fairly certain that was not true. She let it go. She stood with her arms crossed against the cold and watched him work. There was something honest about watching a person do physical work. No room for performance in it. No space for the careful management of impression. He was simply a man fixing a wheel because the wheel was broken. "I asked around about Connolly," she said. His hands stilled for a fraction of a second, then kept moving. "I told you I'd think about it." "You said that 4 days ago." "Thinking takes time." "Not when someone's buying debt in 4 directions," Clara said. "Time is the thing you don't have." He sat back on his heels and looked at her for the first time since she'd come outside, direct measuring the way he looked at everything. "What did you find out?" 3 farms, east of town, south of Billings Creek, and the Haller property if he doesn't resolve his account by November 15th. She paused. They all had one thing in common. What? Their original loan paperwork had a clause about consolidated interest that most people don't notice when they sign. When payments run late, even partial payments that cover the principal. The consolidated interest clause means the whole debt can be called in at once. She watched his face. It's legal, it's in the document, and it's specifically designed to look like ordinary contract language until you need to fight it. Nate was very still. "You read those contracts," he said. "I asked Ed Haller if I could look at his paperwork. He said yes." "Why?" It was the same question he had asked her 4 days ago outside the school. "Why are you doing this?" She had given him the practical answer. Then she kept good records. She knew financial manipulation. That had been true. It had also been incomplete. "Because 3 families have already lost land," Clara said. And the only reason it keeps working is because each family thinks they're the only one it's happening to. Nate looked at her for a long moment. The wind picked up between them, cold and direct, carrying the smell of coming weather. "How much does he owe?" Nate said. "Holler." $62 in consolidated interest on top of the principal. Nate looked away. He picked up the wrench and turned back to the wheel. "I can cover it," he said. "That's not—" Clara stopped. "That's not the point. If you cover Haller's debt, Connolly just moves to the next one, and the one after that. You can't buy your way out of a system. What would you do instead?" "Document it," Clara said. "All of it. Every family, every contract, every payment record. Make a complete picture of what he's been doing and who he's been doing it to. And then take that picture somewhere it can't be ignored." Nate turned the wrench slowly. "You're talking about a territorial judge. Or a federal one if it comes to it. That takes months." "Yes." "It costs money." "Yes." "And Connolly will know we're coming," Nate said. "People like him always find out, and when they find out they move faster." "I know," Clara said. Another silence. The wheel was fitted now. He was making the final adjustments, checking the alignment, the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything. "Why are you still here?" he said. Not unkind, just honest. The specific honesty of a man who had stopped spending words on anything except what he actually meant. "You made it clear to Agnes you're leaving in April. This fight, if it turns into one, won't be done by April." Clara said nothing for a moment. "It doesn't have to be done for the documentation to matter," she said finally. "I can build the record. Someone else can finish the fight." Nate looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said the thing that was sitting in the space between them, which was that they both knew that was not quite how it worked. Records needed people behind them. Systems needed advocates. She knew this. He knew she knew this. "The wheel's done," he said. He stood, and the full height of him was something she registered every time as a minor surprise, not because she forgot between encounters, but because she always underestimated it somehow. "Thank you," Clara said. "What do I owe you for the wheel?" "Nothing." "Mr. Carter." "Clara," he said. Her name in his voice. Just that one word, 2 syllables, but it landed differently than she expected, like a stone dropped into water, the ripple moving outward before she could stop it. "Clara," he said again, quieter. "The wheel is done. Let it be." He picked up his tools and walked back through the gate. She stood in the cold air, looking at the repaired wagon for longer than the situation warranted. Then she went inside and taught fractions until her hands stopped being unsteady. November settled over Harlan Creek like a decision. The school days shortened. The mornings arrived hard and gray and demanding. The children came in with cold, reddened faces and voices that had absorbed the particular brittleness of winter, and Clara found herself spending the first 15 minutes of each day simply warming them up, stories, questions, anything to get the blood moving again before the real work started. Thomas Carter was the last one in every morning and the last one to warm up, but once he did, he was the sharpest mind in the room. He had figured out sometime in late October that Clara could be engaged in genuine conversation if approached correctly, not like a teacher, but like a person direct and honest. "My uncle asked Agnes about you," he said one afternoon. He said it with the specific studied casualness of a child who had been sitting on this information for several days and had finally decided to deploy it. Clara looked up from the papers she was grading. "Did he?" "He asked how long you'd been teaching," Thomas said. "And she said 2 years in Missouri, and now here. And he asked what you were going to do after, and she said she didn't know." He paused. "But you know, don't you? I have some plans, yes." "Are you going east?" "I'm considering some opportunities east, yes." Thomas absorbed this. He had his uncle's habit of processing things privately internally before responding. "My uncle doesn't talk about people," he said finally. "He doesn't ask about them either. He asked about you twice." Clara set down her pen. She looked at the boy across the desk, 8 years old, measuring her with those watchful eyes that had already seen more than 8 years should carry. "Thomas," she said, "your uncle is a good man, And what he thinks or doesn't think about people in this town is his own business. All right? Thomas considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. All right, he said. He went back to his work. Clara went back to hers. She was smiling before she fully realized it, and she erased the smile quickly and professionally and told herself it meant nothing. The first real snowfall came on a Thursday earlier than expected, covering Harlan Creek in a white that made everything look clean and temporary and slightly unreal. Clara was at the schoolhouse when she heard the commotion from the direction of the main road. Not an argument this time, but something more urgent, voices raised in the particular pitch that meant something had gone wrong with Speed. She went out. Two ranch hands she didn't recognize were helping a third man off a horse. The third man, young, maybe 20, with blood on the side of his face, and his arm held at an angle that was immediately wrong, was trying to stand on his own and not managing it. "Easy," one of the hands was saying. "Easy, Billy." "I'm fine," Billy said, in the voice of a man who was definitively not fine. Agnes appeared beside Clara as if summoned. "What happened?" Agnes asked. "Section of the north fence went down," the first hand said. "Cattle spooked. Billy went over with his horse." He looked past Agnes, scanning the street. "We need to find Nate." "He's at the ranch," the second hand said. "He's not," said the first. "We just came from there. That's why we came to town." Clara looked at Billy at the angle of his arm at the blood on his face. "Bring him inside," she said. "Agnes has supplies." Agnes was already moving. They got Billy inside and onto the kitchen bench. Agnes had a steady, efficient competence in emergencies that Clara recognized and appreciated. No fuss, no wasted motion, just the direct application of practical knowledge. The arm was bad. The head cut was superficial. Billy kept saying he was fine while his face did increasingly poor work of supporting this claim. The first ranch hand, his name was Cord. It turned out stood at the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and something worried working behind his eyes. "How bad is the fence?" Clara asked him quietly. "Bad," Cord said. "North section that's grazing land. If the cattle get onto the Mercer property to the north, old man Mercer'll have something to say about it. And his son'll have more." He looked down. "And Connolly was out there yesterday, walking the property line." Clara went still. "What?" "Walking it," Cord said. "Nate told him to leave. He left. But he was walking that line with a man we didn't recognize, and they were both writing things down." She thought about Connolly's smile in the alley. The particular pleasantness of a man who was never surprised because he was always 3 steps ahead. She thought about the consolidated interest clause. She thought about the timing. North fence down, cattle scattered, Connolly, walking the property line the day before. "Where is Nate?" she said. "That's what I don't know," Cord said. "He rode out this morning to check the east pasture. He should have been back by now." Clara made a decision the same way she made most decisions, quickly, privately, and without spending time she didn't have on second guessing. "Agnes," she said. Agnes looked up from Billy's arm. "I'm going to ride out toward the Carter Ranch," Clara said. Agnes looked at her for one moment. "The road gets icy past Miller's Creek." "I know." "Take the brown mare," Agnes said. "She's sure-footed." "Don't tell me," Clara started. "The brown mare," Agnes said firmly. Clara took the brown mare. She found him at Miller's Creek. Not lost, not injured, standing beside his horse at the edge of the frozen creek bed, looking at the water as if it owed him an explanation. The horse had thrown a shoe somewhere and was favoring the left front leg, and Nate had clearly been standing there long enough that the cold had settled into his face and his hands and the particular set of his shoulders. He turned when he heard her coming. His expression went through several things very quickly. Surprise, something warmer than surprise, and then the closing down reflex that she had come to recognize as habitual rather than hostile. "Your north fence is down," Clara said without preamble. "3 of your men came to town. One of them is at Agnes's with a broken arm and a hard lesson about getting between a spooked horse and a fence post." Nate's jaw tightened. "Billy. He'll be all right." Agnes set the arm. She pulled the mare up beside his horse and looked down at him. Cord says Connolly was walking your north property line yesterday. Something changed in his face. The controlled neutral surface he maintained as a constant effort cracked just for a moment, and just enough that she could see what was underneath it. Not anger. Something colder. The specific look of a man watching a pattern he has seen before come around again from a new direction. He's been circling, Nate said. Yes. For how long? I don't know, but the fence coming down the day after he walks the line. Could be coincidence, Nate said. Flat. Not like he believed it. Like he was giving it the space it deserved before putting it aside. Could be, Clara said. Isn't, he said. No, she said. Probably not. He looked at his horse's leg. He looked at the creek. He looked at the pale winter sky with the expression of a man doing fast arithmetic in his head losses, costs, options time. I need to get back, he said. Your horse can't make it. He needs to be walked. I know that. You can ride with me, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked back. I don't need, he started. Mr. Carter, Clara said. Your horse has a thrown shoe. Your fence is down. Your cattle are scattered, and it's going to be dark in 2 hours. This is not a moment for pride. He was quiet for a long moment. Nate, he said. What? You called me Mr. Carter. My name is Nate. He said it with the particular neutrality of a man delivering a simple fact, not making a request. But underneath the neutrality was something she had started to notice, a small, careful reaching toward, like a plant growing toward light, without committing to the direction. Nate, she said, get on the horse. He got on the horse. She had not anticipated what it would be like to ride back to town with Nate Carter seated behind her. How was careful, scrupulously careful, his hands resting on his own knees rather than her waist, his balance adjusted to compensate for her presence rather than leaning on it. But he was there, present in a way that didn't allow itself to be ignored. She could feel the warmth of him through the cold air, and she could hear his breathing, and she was acutely, mortifyingly conscious of the 6 inches between his chest and her back. She focused on the road. How was quiet for a while. Then he said, You didn't have to come out here. Someone had to tell you about the fence. Cord would have found me. Cord was busy keeping Billy from trying to stand on a broken arm. A pause. Still. Nate, she said, and she heard herself say his name in a new register, not sharp, not instructive, just plain. Not everything I do has to have a reason beyond the obvious one. Another pause. Longer. What's the obvious one? He said. She didn't answer immediately. The mare moved steadily beneath them. The light was going amber at the edges. The way winter light in Wyoming went amber fast and total, like someone turning down a lamp. You needed to know, she said finally. I knew. That's all. He was quiet for the rest of the ride. But it was a different quiet than the one he usually carried, less closed. More like a man sitting inside a thought he hadn't expected to be comfortable. At the ranch, the next 2 hours were organized chaos. The hands had gotten most of the cattle back. The fence section needed posts, and the posts needed to come from the supply barn, and the supply barn needed 2 people who knew where things were. Clara ended up in the barn with a lantern and a ranch hand named Pete, who was 60 years old and had the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who had solved 100 problems before breakfast. She had not intended to spend her Thursday evening in a cattle ranch supply barn. She was efficient about it anyway. She found the posts. She found the wire. She found the tools. She organized them into a logical order for the repair crew, and then she helped Pete carry the first load out to the wagon, and then she helped Pete carry the second load, and somewhere in the process, she stopped thinking of it as a detour from her evening and started simply being present in the work. Nate found her at the 3rd load. You don't have to do this, he said. I know. She handed him a post. Here. He took it. He looked at her for a moment in the lantern light at her coat, which was now carrying a thorough application of barn dust, and at her hair, which had escaped its pins at some point in the loading process, and at her face, which she was reasonably sure reflected the situation accurately. Then he said, Are you hungry? She stopped. She registered for the first time that she had not eaten since morning. Yes. she said with more feeling than she intended. Something moved across Nate Carter's face. It started in his eyes and made its way to the corner of his mouth very slowly, like a man who had gotten out of the habit of the expression and was remembering it carefully. It was almost a smile. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "Come inside," he said. "Thomas has probably already eaten the good parts, but there should be something left." The Carter kitchen was nothing she had expected. She didn't know what she had expected. Something spare and functional, the kitchen of a man living alone with an 8-year-old. But the kitchen was warm, and it smelled like wood smoke, and something savory, and there were drawings on the wall beside the window. Thomas's drawings clearly pinned up in a row, with the particular importance given to things that matter. Thomas himself was at the table with a book, and when Clara walked in behind his uncle, his face did something complicated and quickly controlled delight, surprise, and the studied neutral expression of a child who had decided to be cool about it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Hello, Thomas." "Did you ride out to find Uncle Nate?" "I did." Thomas looked at his uncle. His uncle looked back at him with an expression that communicated clearly, "Don't." Thomas looked back at his book. But the corner of his mouth was doing something that Clara recognized as a direct inheritance. She ate at the Carter table, and she talked to Thomas about the book he was reading, an adventure story about the sea, which he had chosen deliberately because he had decided at some point that he wanted to know what the ocean looked like, and she talked to Nate about the fence repair and the cattle count and the specific legal language of the consolidated interest clause that she had memorized from Haller's contract. That last topic killed the almost comfortable feeling in the kitchen, not because Nate shut down, but because he went to the place he went when something cost him more than he wanted to show the particular stillness of a man who is doing the accounting of a problem and not liking the numbers. "He's moving faster," Nate said. "Yes. Which means he thinks he's close. Or that someone else is getting close to him," Clara said. Nate looked at her. "If he felt completely safe," Clara said, "he'd move slowly. The fact that he's accelerating means he thinks there's a risk of exposure. Which means our window is shorter than I thought, but it also means the documentation matters more, not less." "Our window," Nate said. She heard what he was noting. The word she had used. She didn't correct it. "There are 12 families in this county, with debt instruments from companies Connolly represents," Clara said. "If I can get access to their contracts, even half of them, I can map the pattern. Judges respond to patterns. They can ignore one family. They can't ignore 12. Some of those families won't want to share their financial papers with anyone," Nate said. "Some of them will," Clara said, "especially if you ask them." He looked at her. "They trust you," she said simply. "You've been here. You've covered Harold's 2 weeks. You've left supplies. You've shown up." She met his eyes. "The only reason Connolly hasn't come after you first is that your operation is solid enough to require a stronger play. But he'll come. You know he'll come." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas had stopped pretending to read. He was watching his uncle with those careful, watchful eyes that had spent 3 years learning to read the weather in a man's face. Nate looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the drawings on the wall. He looked at Clara. "What do you need from me?" he said. She exhaled a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Introductions," she said, "and the names of every family you know of who's had dealings with Connolly's company, and your own paperwork if you're willing. Whatever your father's original land grant showed, and every transaction since." Nate was quiet for a moment. "My father's paperwork is in a box in the back room," he said. "Nobody's touched it since he died." "I'll need to go through it carefully," she said. "It will take time." "All right. Nate." She said his name with the weight it needed. "This could get complicated before it gets resolved. If Connolly realizes someone is building a case against him, he will push back. Hard. He has resources, and he has lawyers, and he is very good at what he does." "I know what I'm getting into," he said. "Do you, Clara?" And now his voice had the weight too, the specific gravity of a man saying something he has decided to say and means completely. "I have been fighting for this land since I was 19 years old. I have fought drought and debt and a man I called a friend who took everything I gave him and used it to destroy me." He paused. "I know what I'm getting into. I have always known. The only difference now is—" He stopped. Thomas was looking at him. Clara was looking at him. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the table. "The only difference now," he said quieter, "is that I'm not fighting alone." The sentence settled into the kitchen, like snow settling quiet, and covering everything, and changing the look of the landscape without making a sound. Thomas turned a page of his book. Clara looked at Nate Carter across the kitchen table and told herself firmly and specifically, and without any room for revision, that she was leaving in April. She told herself that twice. It didn't take the way it used to. Outside, the wind found the north side of the ranch house and tested it the way Wyoming tested everything, without malice, without relief, simply to know what would hold. The house held. Clara stayed at the table and drank her coffee and looked at the drawings on the wall, and for the first time since arriving in the territory, she did not think about the train. The box from Nate's father was heavier than it looked. Clara lifted it onto the Carter kitchen table on a Saturday morning in early December, while Thomas was at the Greer farm, helping Rosie's father with a fence repair. Something Nate had arranged deliberately, she suspected, though he hadn't said so. The box held 15 years of a man's life, reduced to paper land, grants, cattle receipts, water rights agreements, 2 promissory notes paid in full, and 1 mortgage document that Clara read 3 times before she set it down, and sat very still and looked at the wall. "What is it?" Nate said. He was standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee. He had been watching her work for the past hour with the particular attention of a man who had decided to trust someone completely and was still learning what that felt like. "Your father's original land grant," Clara said. "Section 14 North Boundary. I know what it covers." "Does it cover Miller's Creek?" Nate went still. "The creek is on the western edge of the north section. Yes. Because this document—" Clara turned it and pushed it across the table toward him. "This document has a notation in the margin, handwritten, in different ink than the original." Nate came to the table and looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "That's not my father's handwriting," he said. "No," Clara said. "It isn't." The notation was small and precise. 4 lines of text that reassigned the western water rights of the north section to a holding company. The holding company's name meant nothing to Clara Territorial Land Resources, but the date of the notation was 6 weeks ago. Nate was very still. "Someone has been in this house," he said. The word landed like a stone in still water. Clara waited. "That box has been in the back room since my father died," Nate said. His voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled when the alternative is considerably worse. "Nobody goes back there. The hands don't go in the house without reason. Thomas doesn't touch the boxes." He picked up the document and looked at it again. "Someone came into this house and altered my father's land grant. The alteration isn't legal," Clara said immediately. "A marginal notation in different ink with no witness signatures, no notary seal. It wouldn't hold in court. But if Connolly files on the water rights before we catch it—" "He files first, it becomes a dispute," Nate said. "And disputes take time. And while it's in dispute, I can't use the creek water for the North Herd." He set the paper down. "The North Herd is my primary income for the spring market." Clara looked at him. "He's not trying to take your land." "No," Nate said. "He's trying to make your land worthless." "Yes," he said. "So I'll sell it." The precision of it was almost elegant in the way that truly ugly things are sometimes elegant. Not brute force, not illegal seizure, just the slow, careful removal of everything that made the land viable until the owner had no choice but to accept whatever number was offered. "How long ago could this have been done?" Clara asked. "Box was last moved in September," Nate said, "when I was looking for the cattle registry for last year's market." "So between September and now?" "Yes." "Who has access to the house?" "Me, Thomas, Cord, Mrs. Haverford, who comes to cook twice a week." He paused. "And 3 weeks ago, I had a man come to assess the roof damage from the August storm, sent by the county office." Clara looked at him. I didn't know him, Nate said. He said it like a man accepting a verdict. I let him in because he had county paperwork. Do you still have the paperwork? Somewhere. Find it, Clara said. Today. He found it within the hour, a county assessment form with the name Harold Birch and a county seal that Clara looked at for 60 seconds before she said quietly, but with complete certainty, "This seal is wrong." Wrong how? The territorial seal has an eagle with spread wings. This one's wings are folded. She set it down. This is a forgery. Harold Birch came into your house under false county authorization. Nate sat down. It was the first time she had seen him sit down in the middle of the day. He pulled out the chair and sat in it like a man who needed a moment to let the shape of something sink in fully before he stood up again. He's been planning this for months, Nate said. At least since September, Clara said. Possibly longer. The fence, Nate said. What? The north fence came down 3 weeks ago. I assumed it was the storm damage. But if someone wanted access to the property to document what was there... He stopped. Walk the north property line, Clara said, like Connolly did the day before. Establish a claim to disputed territory, Nate finished. Then file on the water rights present the altered document as supporting evidence and tie me up in legal proceedings until I'm bleeding money. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. He's already filed, Clara said. Or he's about to. The timing of the fence, the forged assessment, the notation. This is the end of the setup, not the middle. Nate was quiet for a moment. What do we do? She had the answer ready because she had been building toward it for 6 weeks without fully knowing it. We go to the families, she said. All of them. Today if possible. We get the documents. We build the complete picture, not just your case, all of them together. And we get it to Judge Harlan in Cheyenne before Connolly's filing clears the territorial desk. Harlan's a 4-hour ride. I know. The filing desk closes Friday at 5. What day is it today? Nate looked at her steadily. Wednesday. 2 days. Clara picked up the assessment form and the altered land grant and set them side by side on the table. She looked at them the way her father had taught her to look at numbers, not with panic, not with hope, but with clear, unblinking attention to what was actually there. Then we start now, she said. The next 14 hours were the hardest work Clara had done since coming to Wyoming. Nate rode to the Holler farm while Clara went to 2 families east of town, the Morrisons and the Steele family, carrying the same message. We need your contracts and your payment records. We need them today. We're building a case and your name is part of it, and if you trust us, you'll have your land back by spring. The Morrisons said yes before she finished the sentence. Margaret Morrison, 60 years old, with hands that told the story of 30 years of frontier work, pulled a biscuit tin out from under the bed and produced every financial document she owned in 12 seconds. I knew something was wrong, Margaret said. I told Gerald something was wrong with that consolidation clause. He said I was reading too much into it. You weren't, Clara said. I never do, Margaret said. And then firmly, you get my land back, Miss Whitmore. I'm going to try, Mrs. Morrison. Don't try, Margaret said. Do it. The Steele family took longer. Henry Steele was cautious, and cautious men required more than urgency. They required reason and evidence, and the opportunity to think. Clara sat at the Steele table for 40 minutes, laying out exactly what she had found, and exactly what she believed it meant, and exactly what the risk was of helping her versus the risk of not. At the end of the 40 minutes, Henry Steele stood up without a word, went to his office, and came back with a full accordion folder of every financial document related to his ranch for the past 4 years. My father built this, he said. I'm not giving it to a man in a suit from Cheyenne. Clara took the folder. She was back at Agnes's house by 4 in the afternoon. Nate was already there. He had Haller's documents and 2 other families' records, and he had also somehow managed to send word to Cord and have the ranch hands quietly watching the Carter property line for any unfamiliar visitors. They worked at Agnes's kitchen table from 4 in the afternoon until past midnight. Agnes kept coffee coming and did not offer opinions, except once when she pointed out that Clara had miscalculated a date, and once when she said very quietly while passing Nate a fresh cup, "Your father would be glad someone's fighting for it." Nate looked at her. Agnes went back to the stove. Clara built the document line by line, family by family. 12 contracts, 11 payment histories, 7 cross-referenced dates that showed Connolly's pattern of timing. Always buy the debt in January. Always wait for the spring payment cycle. Always present the consolidated interest demand in November, when cash was lowest and options were fewest. Then the forged assessment form, the altered land grant, and a third document that Clara found buried in the Haller records that neither of them had noticed before. She found it at 10:30 at night, and she went very quiet. Nate looked up. "What?" She turned the paper to face him. It was a bill of sale. For the Carter Ranch. Dated 3 weeks from now. Signed by Daniel Connolly as buyer. With a seller's signature line that was blank. Nate looked at the paper. He looked at it for a very long time. His face was completely still in the way that faces are still when the person behind them is working very hard to stay controlled. "He already has the sale document ready," Nate said. "He was going to present you with a fait accompli," Clara said. "Legal pressure on 3 fronts, the water rights dispute, the consolidated interest on any debt instrument he could find, and whatever the forged assessment established. Then offer you the sale as the only way out." "At what price?" Clara looked at the document. There was a number. She told him. Nate closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The number was roughly a third of what the ranch was worth. His own lawyers probably told him it was too low, Nate said. But he figured I'd be desperate enough not to care. "He's done it before," Clara said. "The Morrison land, the property east of Billings Creek. Different numbers, same approach." Nate opened his eyes. He picked up the blank bill of sale and looked at it the way men look at things that have the potential to destroy them directly, without flinching, taking the measure of it. Then he set it down. "Add it to the file," he said. She added it to the file. They left for Cheyenne at 6 the next morning. Clara had not slept. She didn't think Nate had either. Thomas was staying with Agnes. Clara had asked Agnes the night before, and Agnes had said simply, "Of course," in the voice she used when a thing went without saying. The ride to Cheyenne was 4 hours of cold and purpose, and the particular focused quiet of 2 people who have been working side by side long enough that silence between them has changed character, no longer absence of something but presence of something else. An hour out, Nate said, "You didn't have to do this." "I know." "I mean the last 6 weeks," he said. "The records, the families, last night." He paused. "You came here to save money and leave in April." "Yes," Clara said. "This is not that." She looked at the road ahead. The sky was pale and clear and enormous. "No," she said. "It isn't." Another silence. "Why?" he said. She had been expecting the question. She had been preparing an answer that was practical and bounded and didn't require her to say anything she wasn't ready to say. What came out instead was the truth. Because watching Connolly do what he does to people who built their lives from nothing on land they earned with 30 years of work. "It made me angry," she said. "And I have very good records. And someone who is angry and has very good records and knows what she's looking at is the most dangerous thing in the world to a man like Connolly." She paused. "So I did the dangerous thing." Nate was quiet for a moment. "That's not the whole answer," he said. She didn't reply. He didn't push. They rode into Cheyenne at 10 in the morning with the file, the documents, and 47 minutes before the territorial filing desk closed for the day. Judge Harlan's clerk was a small, precise man named Everett, who had clearly seen everything that could come through a territorial filing office, and had decided to respond to all of it with the same measured neutrality. He received the file from Clara's hands, looked at the volume of it, looked at Clara, looked at Nate, and said, "This will require review." "It requires review today," Clara said. "There is a water rights filing pending under the name Territorial Land Resources. We have evidence that the supporting documentation for that filing was obtained through fraud and document alteration. If that filing clears before this evidence is entered, the legal clock starts running in the wrong direction." Everett looked at her again. You're the schoolteacher from Harlan Creek. Yes. Agnes Pruitt's schoolteacher. Yes. He looked at the file. Does Agnes know you're here? Agnes knows everything, Clara said. Something moved through Everett's face that might in another man have been a smile. He picked up the file. I'll take this to Judge Harlan immediately, he said. Wait here. They waited. The waiting room of the territorial courthouse was a study in other people's worst days. Clara could feel the shape of every difficult thing that had been decided in this building, the claims and the losses and the legal machinery that processed human lives into documents and precedent. She sat very straight in the hard chair and kept her hands folded and looked at nothing. Beside her, Nate sat with his elbows on his knees and his hat between his hands. If Harlan won't see us today, he started. He'll see us, Clara said. You sound very certain. Everett recognized Agnes's name, Clara said. Agnes has lived in this territory for 40 years. She knows every judge in Wyoming. She paused. I may have asked her to send a letter ahead of us yesterday afternoon. Nate turned and looked at her. While you were copying the Morrison documents, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked forward again. You think of everything, he said. I think of most things, Clara said. I missed the forged assessment for 3 weeks. That bothers me. You found it, he said. Eventually. That's usually how finding things works, he said. And his voice had that quality, the one she had heard first in the kitchen with Thomas, unguarded and real, and a different version of him entirely from the man who stood in the road with his horse, and his deliberate neutrality. She looked at him. I was looking at his hat. Nate, she said. Don't, he said. Quiet. Don't say whatever comes after that. Not yet. He turned the hat once. Let me get through today first. She understood that. She respected that. She looked forward again. Everett returned 20 minutes later. Judge Harlan will see you now, he said. Judge Warren Harlan was 63 years old, built like a man who had spent 30 years on horseback before he spent the last 15 behind a bench, and he had the particular quality of authority that comes not from the title, but from the person, the sense that his opinions had been earned rather than granted. He had the file open on his desk when they entered. He looked at Clara first. You built this? Yes, sir. You're a schoolteacher. I kept financial records for 7 years before I taught school, Clara said. And I know what a forged document looks like. Harlan looked at the altered land grant. Who had access to the original? Nate explained the forged county assessment, the false authorization, Harold Birch. As he spoke, Harlan made notes, small, precise, the notes of a man who had already formed an opinion and was now confirming it methodically. When Nate finished, Harlan set down his pen. The water rights filing under Territorial Land Resources came across my desk yesterday morning, he said. I held it. He looked at both of them. I held it because the supporting documentation included a margin notation that I found irregular. Clara's breath left her slowly. You already saw it, she said. I saw it, Harlan said. I didn't have the context to understand what I was seeing until you walked in 20 minutes ago. He closed the file. I'm issuing a hold on all Territorial Land Resources filings in this jurisdiction pending a full fraud investigation. I'm also issuing a preservation order on your father's original land grant, Mr. Carter, which means the altered notation has no legal standing until the matter is resolved. Nate said nothing. Clara watched him absorb it, the relief the 6 weeks of work landing somewhere solid, the specific sensation of having fought for something and found that the fight had been worth having. How long for the investigation? Clara asked. 6 to 8 weeks, Harlan said. Connolly will be notified. He will likely obtain legal representation and contest the fraud classification. He looked at her steadily. This is not over. I know, Clara said, but you've made it considerably harder for him to continue, Harlan said. The pattern you've documented across 12 families, that's the thing that matters. Individual cases can be contested one at a time. A pattern this clear, this consistent across this many families. He paused. That's a different kind of case. He stood. He shook Nate's hand, and then after a brief consideration, Clara's. Good work, Miss Whitmore, he said. Agnes speaks highly of you. I'll tell her you said so, Clara said. They were outside on the courthouse steps when it caught up with them. Not all of it, not the full weight of the 6 weeks, and the late nights, and the family's trust, folded into accordion files. Just enough of it. Just the cold air and the clear sky, and the fact that they had walked in with a problem and walked out with something that looked for the first time like a solution. Nate stood beside her and looked out at the street below. It's not done, he said. No, Clara said. 6 to 8 weeks, and Connolly will fight it. I know. He was quiet for a moment. But it's different now. Yes, she said. It's different now. He turned and looked at her. Full direct with none of the careful management she was accustomed to from him. Just Nate Carter, looking at her with all the complicated, unguarded truth of a man who had stopped pretending he wasn't feeling what he was feeling. You said you're leaving in April, he said. Her chest tightened. Yes. It's December, he said. Yes. That's 4 months, he said. Nate, I'm not asking you anything, he said. I know you made your plan before you came here. I know it doesn't have anything to do with me or Thomas or the ranch or the north pasture. He looked at his hat, then back at her. I'm just noting the calendar, that's all. She looked at him. He looked back. The wind came down the Cheyenne Street and found them both cold and specific, and she felt it the way you feel things when you're paying attention fully, without the buffer of what you've told yourself about what you want. 4 months is a long time, she said. It is, he said. Neither of them said anything else. But when they walked back toward the horses, they walked closer together than the width of the steps required, and neither of them moved to create more distance. Somewhere behind them in the territorial courthouse, Everett was filing a hold on Daniel Connolly's water rights claim, and in a rented office 4 blocks east, Connolly himself was about to receive a message he had not anticipated and would not. Clara was certain take quietly. The fight was not over. But for the first time since Clara Whitmore had set foot in Wyoming territory with a train ticket in her pocket and a plan to be somewhere else by spring. For the first time, she was not certain she wanted to be anywhere else at all. Connolly did not take the news quietly. Clara had known he wouldn't. Men like Connolly, men who had built entire systems on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to understand what they were looking at, did not receive exposure gracefully. They received it like a cornered animal receives a wall with everything they had left. The first move came 4 days after Cheyenne. Nate found it when he rode into town on a Monday morning, a notice posted on the board outside the dry goods store, formal and legal, and typed on paper with a Cheyenne letterhead. It stated that the Carter Ranch was under review for unpaid territorial grazing fees dating back 11 years. The amount listed was $412. Nate read it twice. Then he pulled it off the board and walked to Agnes's house without stopping. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Agnes stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a specific expression that she reserved for things that were both predictable and infuriating. Territorial grazing fees, Clara said. My father paid every territorial fee on record, Nate said. His voice was flat. I have the receipts. Where? In the box, with the land grant documents. Get them today, Clara said. All of them. Every receipt, every year, every amount. She set the notice down. He knew we were building a case around the pattern. This is the counter move. He's going to try to bury us in individual disputes, so we spend the next year responding to each one instead of prosecuting the fraud. Can he do that? Agnes asked. He can try, Clara said. The question is whether we move faster. She looked at Nate. Who else got notices? Nate's jaw was tight. I don't know yet. Find out, she said. Today. He was out the door in 30 seconds. Clara looked at the notice on the table. She thought about Connolly, wherever he was right now in his rented office, or on a stage back to Cheyenne, and she thought about the particular smile he had worn in the alley that first day. Patient. Certain. The smile of a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't route around. She thought, not this time. She picked up her pen and went back to work. By Tuesday afternoon, Nate had confirmed that 6 other families had received similar notices. Grazing fees, water usage assessments, unclear boundary notations. Each one technically legal. Each one requiring a formal response. Each one hit simultaneously, like a wave designed to knock people off their feet. Harold put his notice on Clara's desk without a word and sat down across from her with the look of a man measuring his remaining options. $460, Harold said. Harold. Clara looked at him directly. Do you have your payment records? Some of them. How many? Most, I think. He rubbed his face. Margaret organized them better than I did. Bring Margaret tomorrow, Clara said. Bring everything you have. We are not responding to these notices individually. We are responding to all of them together as a pattern, as additional evidence of systematic legal harassment, following the fraud filing. If Connolly wants to escalate, he has just handed us 3 more exhibits. Harold stared at her. You're not worried. I'm extremely worried, Clara said. I just find that useful. He almost laughed. He caught it before it got all the way out, but she saw it, the small, desperate relief of a man who needed someone else to be steady so he could borrow the steadiness. All right, he said. Tomorrow, both of us. Bring the biscuit tin, Clara said. He blinked. Margaret's biscuit tin, Clara said. She keeps her documents in it. Tell her I said to bring all of it. Harold looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once. Gratitude, wonder, and the specific warmth of a man recognizing that someone has been paying more attention than he realized. Yes, ma'am, he said. The days that followed were the most demanding of Clara's life. She taught school every morning. She was still a school teacher. She still had 11 children who needed fractions and reading, and someone who showed up every day, regardless of what else was happening. And then she worked on the documents every afternoon and deep into the evenings. Agnes's kitchen became a kind of command center, papers, organized by family, by date, by legal category, each one cross-referenced to the fraud evidence from Cheyenne. Nate appeared every evening. I didn't make a production of it. He arrived usually around 6, sometimes with Thomas, and sometimes not, and he sat at the table and helped organizing, copying, reviewing. He was not a lawyer, and he had no pretense of being one, but he was meticulous, and he was tireless, and he knew the land, the families, the history better than any document could capture. The Steele property, he said one evening, looking at Henry Steele's records. The west boundary here, that's not right. Clara looked up. Which part? This assessment marks the west boundary at Miller's Fork. But Miller's Fork shifted course 8 years ago in the spring flood. The actual boundary is 40 yards further west now. Clara stared at him. How do you know that? Because I helped Henry rebuild his west fence that summer, Nate said. I know where we put the posts. Clara put her pen down. That means the boundary notation Connolly's been using is referencing a geographic feature that no longer exists in that location. Which means his water rights claim on the Staley property is based on a boundary that doesn't exist, Nate said. That's not just fraud, Clara said. That's provable physical fraud. We can put Henry Steele on the stand. We can put you on the stand. We can put anyone who helped with that fence on the stand, and the boundary collapses. Nate looked at her steadily. That changes things. It changes everything, Clara said. She wrote it down. She wrote it in capital letters at the top of the Staley section and underlined it twice. Thomas, who had been doing his arithmetic at the corner of the table, looked at the paper and then at his uncle, and then at Clara, with the expression he got when adults were behaving in a way he found interesting. Is that good? Thomas asked. It's very good, Clara said. Thomas nodded and went back to his arithmetic, as if this satisfied him completely. The second wave from Connolly came on a Thursday, and it was worse. Not a legal notice this time. Not a document. A man, 2 men actually arriving in Harlan Creek on a morning stage with leather satchels, and a manner that announced itself before they opened their mouths. Lawyers. From a firm in Denver with a name that took up 3 lines on their calling card. They went to the dry goods store first, then to the feed barn, then to 2 of the ranching families east of town. By noon word had reached Agnes's house. They're offering settlements, Cord said. He had come directly from the East Road where he'd spoken to Pete Morrison's son. Individual settlements, each family. Cash now in exchange for dropping all claims against Connolly's company. Clara set down her coffee cup. How much? Nate said. Enough, Cord said. Not full value, but enough that a family looking at a winter with legal fees and uncertainty, enough that it looks good. It's not good, Clara said. If they settle individually, the pattern disappears. He keeps his fraud framework intact. He pays out a fraction of what it cost him to establish it, and he moves to the next county and does it again to a different set of families. They don't know that, Cord said. No, Clara said. They don't. Nate was already standing. I need to get to the Haverford place, he said. And Morrison's, before those lawyers do. Go, Clara said. I'll take the two families on the East Road. You don't have to. Go, she said. We don't have time. He went. She went. She spent the next 4 hours at kitchen tables she had never sat at before, talking to people she barely knew, asking them to choose uncertainty over the immediate relief of a check in their hands. It was the hardest kind of persuasion, not against a villain, but against very reasonable human fear. The Becketts said no. They took the settlement. Their son was sick. Their winter feed was short. The check was real money today, and the lawsuit was a promise about tomorrow. And Clara looked at them and understood completely, and told them she understood completely, and walked back to her horse, feeling the weight of it. The Nelsons said yes. Frank Nelson, 62 years old with his wife June beside him, looked at Clara's file, and looked at the calling card from the Denver law firm and said, "What they're doing to us, they did to my brother in Colorado. He sold his land for nothing. I'm not my brother." June Nelson put her hand on her husband's arm. "What do we need to do?" Clara told them. She rode back to Agnes's house with the Nelson documents and the Beckett absence, and the precise, sober knowledge that not everyone could afford to fight, and that this was not a moral failing. It was simply the shape of how things were, and the shape of how men like Connolly counted on things being. Nate was already back when she arrived. He had gotten to 4 families. 3 were staying in. 1 had settled before he arrived. They stood in Agnes's kitchen and looked at each other and did the arithmetic. 10 families with documentation. 2 settlements. The Stela boundary evidence. The altered land grant. The forged assessment. The blank bill of sale with Nate's name on the seller line and no signature. "Is it enough?" Nate said. "For the fraud case, yes," Clara said. "For every individual property dispute he's going to file in the next month, we'll have to fight them one by one." "How long?" "Harlan said 6 to 8 weeks for the investigation. If he finds what we gave him sufficient, and I think he will then. Connolly's operating license in Wyoming Territory gets suspended pending resolution. That stops the new filings." She paused. "But Connolly knows that too, which means he's going to try to do something before the investigation concludes." "Something like what?" Agnes said from the doorway. "Something dramatic," Clara said. "He's a man who's losing control of a situation he built very carefully. Men like that don't accept losses gracefully. They make things worse first." Agnes looked at Nate. Nate looked at Clara. "What do we do?" he said. "We stay close," Clara said. "We watch. And we make sure the documentation is somewhere he can't touch it." "Where's that?" Cord asked. "With Judge Harlan," Clara said. "Already. I sent copies 3 days ago." She looked at Nate. "I sent copies of your father's land grant, the forged assessment, the altered notation, and the blank bill of sale. Originals are at Agnes's. Copies are in the Territorial Courthouse in Cheyenne." She paused. "He can't alter what he can't reach." The room was quiet. "You sent them 3 days ago," Nate said. "Yes." "Before the lawyers arrived." "Before," Clara said. "I expected the lawyers. Not the exact timing, but—" She stopped. Nate was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the careful measuring look. Not the cautious warmth. Something more open than either of those things, and more complicated and considerably harder to look at directly. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said quickly. The same word he had used in Cheyenne. Not now. Let's get through this first. He absorbed that. He nodded once, but the look stayed in his eyes for the rest of the evening. Connolly's dramatic move came on a Saturday. Not lawyers this time. Connolly himself arriving in Harlan Creek on the morning stage, which he had never done before, which meant he had decided that presence was now required. He came alone, without the Denver lawyers, without Harold Birch, without any of the professional apparatus he usually operated through. He went to the dry goods store. He went to the feed barn. He spoke to people. Clara heard about it from Rosie Greer's mother, who appeared at the schoolhouse door during the lunch break with her arms folded and a look that mixed indignation with worry in equal parts. "He's saying things about you," Martha Greer said. Clara stopped. "What kind of things?" "That you're not authorized to practice law," Martha said. "That the document work you've been doing isn't legal. That families who relied on your advice could be in worse trouble than before because you're just a school teacher who has no standing." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong about the authorization," she said. Martha stared. "What?" "I'm not a lawyer," Clara said. "Everything I've done is as a private citizen collecting and organizing evidence. That's legal. But he's going to use the distinction to make people nervous." She looked at Martha. "Is it working?" Martha was quiet for a moment. "Some people are asking questions," she said carefully. "Good," Clara said. "Asking questions is fine. Let them ask questions. I'll answer them." She dismissed school an hour early and spent the afternoon in the town center, not hiding, not avoiding, simply present. Talking to anyone who had questions, answering them directly and honestly, explaining the precise legal difference between practicing law and collecting evidence as a citizen. It was not comfortable work. Several people asked hard questions. Old man Sutherland, who had never liked her much to begin with, said outright that he thought she was overstepping. She told him she understood why he thought so and invited him to look at the documents himself. He did not take her up on it, but he also stopped talking. She was at the edge of the main road about to head back to Agnes's when she heard the voice. "Miss Whitmore?" "Connolly." She turned. Howe was standing 20 feet away, with his hat in his hand, in a gesture that mimicked courtesy, the way a forgery mimics a signature close enough to fool someone not looking carefully. "Mr. Connolly," she said. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot," he said in the tone he used for everything pleasant, steady, utterly certain. "You think so?" she said. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of my business," he said. He took a step toward her. "The families I've worked with have all signed legal contracts. Every clause is disclosed in the document. If they found the terms difficult, that's an issue with their own financial management, not with any fraud." "The forged assessment of the Carter property," Clara said. "Which clause covers that? A beat. Barely perceptible." "I don't know what you're referring to." Harold Birch entered the Carter home under a forged county authorization and altered a margin notation on the original land grant, Clara said. "You hired Harold Birch. I have documentation of both facts. Judge Harlan has copies." She held his gaze. "That's what I'm referring to." Connolly was quiet for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear, not guilt. The recalculation of a man realizing a variable was larger than he had estimated. "You're a school teacher," he said, quieter. "Yes," Clara said. "Funny, isn't it?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on his head precisely the way he did everything. "You should think carefully about what you're getting into," he said. "Legal proceedings are expensive, they're slow, and the people who start them don't always end up where they expected." "Thank you," Clara said. "I'll think about that." She walked away. She waited until she was around the corner of the dry goods store before she let her hands shake for approximately 15 seconds, and then she stopped letting them shake and walked to Agnes's house. Nate was there when she arrived. He saw her face and stood up immediately. "What happened?" "Connolly spoke to me," she said. "In the street." She sat down. "He's not going to stop. He knows the fraud case is too far along to kill, so now he's going to try to make the process expensive enough that the families give up before it concludes." "He threatened you," Nate said. Not a question. He suggested I consider carefully what I was getting into, Clara said. Nate's jaw set. He turned toward the door. Nate, Clara said sharply. He stopped. Sit down, she said. He turned and looked at her. He was very controlled and very close to not being controlled, and she knew him well enough now to read the exact distance between those two things. There is nothing you can do to Connolly in the street that helps any of these families, Clara said. The only place that helps them is in front of Judge Harlan. That's it. Everything else makes our case harder. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he came back and sat down. He threatened you, he said again. Quieter. He's a man losing, Clara said. Losing men make threats. It doesn't change what we do next. What do we do next? We write to Harlan, she said. We document the conversation. We add it to the file as evidence of intimidation following fraud charges, and then we wait. She looked at him. The investigation is at 4 weeks. Harlan told us 6 to 8. We're on track. We stay on track. Nate was quiet. He was looking at his hands on the table. You came here to leave, he said. It was the third time he had said some version of this. Each time it had meant something slightly different. This time it meant, and instead you're facing down a man who just threatened you in the middle of the street. I know, she said. And you're still here. She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was lit, and outside the Wyoming winter was pressing against the walls the way it always did, demanding indifferent enormous. I'm still here, she said. He looked up at her. Those complicated dark eyes with all the history in them, the betrayal, the years of building alone, the careful reconstruction of trust that had taken most of his adult life to manage. After April, he said. Careful, each word chosen. When this is done, I'm not going to ask you to stay because of what you've done here. I'm not going to ask because of the families or the case or because you're useful to me. He stopped. He looked at his hands again. I want you to know that when the time comes, if the time comes, it won't be any of those reasons. Clara did not say anything immediately. She thought about the train ticket that was still technically waiting. The Cincinnati letter she had never followed up on. The penciled number in the leather account book that she had stopped consulting 3 weeks ago without quite noticing. What reason will it be? She said. He looked up. Tell me, she said. Not when the time comes. Now. Tell me now, Nate. He was very still. Then he said, because since you got here, I wake up in the morning and I want to get things right. Not just the ranch, not just the land. He paused. I want to get things right in a way I haven't cared about since before I stopped trusting people. He held her gaze. That's not the ranch. That's you. The kitchen was very quiet. Agnes, who had been in the next room with extraordinary diplomatic patience for the past 20 minutes, could be heard moving toward the far end of the house with the specific tact of a woman removing herself from a scene at exactly the right moment. Clara looked at Nate Carter across the table. I'm not going to tell you I'm staying, she said. Not tonight, not yet. She held up her hand before he could speak. But I'm going to tell you that I don't know anymore what I would be going back to. And that's different from what I knew when I arrived. He absorbed this. He nodded once slowly. That's enough, he said. Is it ye for now, he said. Yes. Outside the wind found the Carter house from a new direction, the northwest sharp and deliberate. The lamp on the table flickered once and steadied. They sat together in the warm kitchen with the winter pressing at the walls and 100 unanswered things between them, and neither of them reached for the distance they would have reached for 3 months ago. That was its own kind of answer. The letter from Judge Harlan arrived on a Tuesday 3 days later. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Nate stood behind her with Thomas beside him, both of them quiet waiting. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly, and then she put it down on the table and turned around. He found sufficient evidence of a systematic fraud scheme operating across the territory, she said. He's issuing a full suspension of Territorial Land Resources Operating Authority in Wyoming, effective immediately. All pending filings are frozen. The fraud investigation is being referred to federal jurisdiction. Thomas looked at his uncle. Nate looked at Clara. All of them, he said. All of them, she said. Every filing, every notice, every assessment. She paused. He's done in Wyoming. The room was so quiet she could hear the wind. And then Nate Carter, the man who had not smiled in front of her, except in those small controlled fractions, put both hands on the table and bent his head and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below. The past 11 months, or the past 3 years, or possibly from somewhere further back than that, from the 19-year-old boy who had inherited a piece of hard land and a full load of debt, and had decided against every reasonable calculation to stay. Thomas put his hand on his uncle's arm. It was a small gesture. 8 years old, and utterly certain the way children are certain when they know exactly what is needed. Nate put his hand over the boy's and held it there. Clara looked at the letter on the table and thought about 12 families sleeping easier tonight without knowing yet why. She thought about Margaret Morrison's biscuit tin, about Frank Nelson saying, "I'm not my brother," about Ed Haller's twins in her classroom who were going to grow up on the land their father had built. She thought about a woman who had arrived in Wyoming with a train ticket pressed against her chest like a compass. She thought about what the compass was pointing toward now. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to the account book that she hadn't opened in a month, and looked at the man and the boy at the table and felt something settle in her chest that was so quiet and so complete that she almost missed it. Almost. The letter from Cincinnati arrived on a Wednesday morning in late January. Clara found it on Agnes's kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl, her name written in the careful hand of a school administrator who had taken her application seriously. She picked it up. She turned it over. She did not open it immediately, which told her something she hadn't been ready to know 3 months ago. Agnes was at the stove. She did not look up. "It came yesterday," Agnes said. "I put it there when you were at the school." "I see it," Clara said. "You haven't opened it." "I'm about to." Agnes turned from the stove and looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes that had been reading people for 71 years. "Clara," she said, "you don't have to open it right now." "Yes, I do," Clara said. Because not opening it was its own kind of answer, and she refused to make decisions by avoidance. She had come too far for that. She opened it. The Cincinnati school was offering her a position. Full term starting September. Salary 20% higher than Harlan Creek. Housing provided. A real city, a real school, a real future on the eastern side of everything she had run toward when she left Missouri. She read it twice. She set it down. She looked at the wall where Thomas Carter's drawings would have been if she were standing in a different kitchen. "Well," Agnes said. "They're offering me the position," Clara said. Agnes nodded. She turned back to the stove. "When do they need an answer?" "March 1st. It was January 22nd. "That gives you 5 weeks, Agnes said. "Yes," Clara said. "To decide," Agnes said. "What you want." Clara folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket next to the account book next to Judge Harlan's letter, which she had been carrying for 2 weeks, like a small piece of completed evidence. Her pocket had become a kind of archive, the sum of everything she had done in Wyoming, pressing against her side. "I'm going to school," she said. She went to school. She taught fractions, and she taught reading, and she answered Rosie Greer's 11 questions about the letter alphabet, and she watched Thomas Carter work through a long division problem with the focused private determination of a boy who had decided that getting things right mattered. And she thought about the Cincinnati letter every 40 minutes without meaning to. At the end of the day, Thomas was the last one out the door as always. He stopped at the threshold the way he sometimes did, calculating something. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes, Thomas." "Are you going to leave in April?" She looked at him. 8 years old, measuring her with his uncle's eyes. Asking the question his uncle wouldn't ask, because his uncle had decided to let her come to her own answer in her own time. "I don't know yet," she said. Honest because he deserved honesty. He absorbed this. He nodded slowly, the way Nate nodded when he was accepting information he didn't necessarily like. "Okay," he said. And then, "I hope you don't." He walked out. Clara stood in the empty schoolroom for a long moment. She looked at the board at the arithmetic she hadn't erased yet at the row of small desks that had stopped feeling temporary sometime in November. She thought, when did this stop being temporary? She didn't have a clean answer. That was the thing about the way it had happened, not a single moment, not a decision, but an accumulation. A repaired wagon wheel. A box of her father's papers on a kitchen table. A man who arrived early to pick up a boy who was watching the door. She erased the board and went home. She told Nate about the letter that evening. He had come to Agnes's after supper. He came most evenings now, and nobody pretended this was accidental, and they were at the kitchen table with the last of the case documentation spread between them. The federal investigation was proceeding. Connolly had retained his Denver lawyers and filed 3 counter-objections in the past 2 weeks, each one carefully constructed and each one addressed by the evidence already in federal hands. The outcome was not guaranteed, but the direction was clear. She put the Cincinnati letter on the table between the documents. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. Cincinnati, he said. A school there, Clara said. Full-term position, September start. He was quiet. More money, she said. Larger school, real city. I know what Cincinnati is, he said. I know you do. He picked up the letter. He read it. She watched his eyes move across the page, careful and complete the same way he read everything. He set it back down. He did not say anything for a long moment. This is what you came west for, he said finally. This is the next step in the plan you had when you arrived. It was, Clara said. He heard the tense. He looked up. What do you want? He said. She had been waiting for this question. She had been both dreading it and needing it the way you need the thing that forces you to stop navigating by instruments you no longer trust. I want to know that I'm choosing, she said. Whatever I decide I want to know, I chose it, not ran from it, not avoided it. She looked at him. I spent my whole life moving toward the next safe thing. Missouri to Wyoming. Wyoming to Cincinnati. Always the next safe thing. Is that what Cincinnati is? Nate said. Safe. Yes, she said. And staying here isn't? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. It isn't. Staying here means... She stopped. Say it, he said. Staying here means wanting something, she said. And I have very specific experience with what happens when you want something and then lose it. My father's health, his debts, the life I thought I was going to have. She held his gaze. Wanting things is expensive, Nate. I've been paying that bill for 3 years. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and even and completely undefended. I know what it costs, he said. I know better than most. I trusted a man completely, and he used everything I gave him to take from me. He looked at his hands. After Douglas, I told myself I was done. Done trusting, done wanting, done reaching for anything I couldn't put a fence around and protect alone. Clara said nothing. She waited. Then you came to my town, he said, planning to leave before you arrived, and somehow, he stopped. He started again. Somehow a woman who was planning to leave is the reason I started wanting things again, which is either the best irony I've ever lived through or the worst. The corner of his mouth moved. I haven't decided which. Clara felt something in her chest unlock with a small, quiet click. Nate, she said. I'm not finished, he said. I need to say this right. He looked up. I am not going to tell you to stay because I need you. I am not going to tell you to stay because of the case or the families or anything that happened with Connolly. I am going to tell you. He stopped. He took a breath. I am going to tell you that this ranch has walls and a roof and a boy who does his arithmetic at the kitchen table, and I have spent 11 years making it work. But it has never once felt like a home the way it has felt these last 4 months. He held her gaze. That's not the land. That's not the cattle. That's you, Clara. You are the reason it feels like home. The kitchen was so quiet that the lamp flame was audible. 5 weeks, she said. What? I have 5 weeks before I have to answer Cincinnati. She did not look away from him. Give me 5 weeks. Let me finish something here before I decide. He looked at her. What do you need to finish? he said. "I'll know when it's done," she said. He nodded. He picked up the nearest document. He went back to work. But the Cincinnati letter stayed on the table between them for the rest of the evening, and neither of them moved it. 3 days later, Connolly's lawyers made their final move. It came through federal channels, a counterfiling that Clara had not anticipated, targeting not the fraud case itself, but the standing of the evidence. Connolly's Denver firm had found something, a technicality, in the way the Morrison family's payment records had been transferred to the federal file. A chain of custody issue, narrow but real, that called into question the admissibility of 3 of the 12 family's documents. The federal clerk's letter arrived Thursday morning. Clara read it and went cold. Not panicked. Cold. The specific temperature of someone who has just seen the shape of a mistake and is calculating how bad it actually is. She went to Agnes first. 3 families' records have a chain of custody problem, she said. Morrison, Nelson, and Beckett, except Beckett settled, so really Morrison and Nelson. The records were transferred to the federal file through me, not through legal counsel. Connolly's lawyers are arguing that as a private citizen with no legal standing, my handling of the documents breaks the evidentiary chain. Agnes looked at her steadily. Can they do that? They're doing it, Clara said. The question is whether it holds. She sat down. If the Morrison and Nelson records are excluded, the pattern weakens. Not fatally, we still have 10 families, but Connolly's lawyers will use it to argue that the remaining evidence is similarly tainted. It might force a hearing. And a hearing takes time, Agnes said. Time is what he's been buying all along, Clara said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, Everett. Clara looked up. Harlan's clerk, Agnes said. Everett has been at the territorial courthouse for 23 years. He knows every procedural rule in the territory. She paused. And he has known me since before he had gray hair. Get him on the telegraph today. Clara sent the telegram within the hour. Everett's reply came by 4 in the afternoon. It was 7 words: transfer documents again through county sheriff's office. Clara stared at it. She stared at it until the solution arranged itself. The county sheriff was a legal authority. If the Morrison and Nelson families transferred their documents directly to Sheriff Aldis, and Aldis submitted them to the federal file as a law enforcement action rather than a citizen referral, the chain of custody issue dissolved. Agnes, she said. Agnes appeared in the doorway. I need to get to the Morrison farm, Clara said. And the Nelsons. Take the brown mare, Agnes said. She's faster. Clara was out the door in 90 seconds. She got to both farms by evening. Margaret Morrison, when Clara explained the situation, looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who had spent 60 years dealing with problems by identifying the solution and executing it without commentary. Tell me what to sign, Margaret said. Frank Nelson was the same. Whatever it takes, he said. Where's the paper? Clara drafted both transfer documents at the Nelson kitchen table by lamplight, walked them to Sheriff Aldis at 8 in the evening, waited while he reviewed them with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood that what he signed mattered, and rode back to Agnes's house with the signed documents in her coat at 9:15. She sent the telegraph to the federal clerk's office the same night. She sat down at Agnes's kitchen table and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she sat up and made coffee. Nate arrived at 10. He had heard from Cord, who had heard from Pete Morrison, who had ridden to tell him what was happening. He came through Agnes's door with his coat still on and his hat in his hand, and looked at Clara, sitting at the table with her coffee and the lamp, and the specific stillness of a woman who has just spent 6 hours preventing a disaster. You fixed it, he said. Everett fixed it, Clara said. I just moved fast. You're allowed to take credit for moving fast, he said. She looked up at him. He was standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression that had stopped trying to be anything other than what it was. Sit down, Nate, she said. He sat down. She pushed a cup of coffee toward him. He took it. This is almost over, she said. The chain of custody problem is resolved. The federal investigation has everything it needs. Connolly is not going to walk away clean. His lawyers can slow things down, but they can't reverse what we've built. I know, he said. Which means in a few weeks, there won't be an emergency anymore. She looked at her cup. There won't be a reason to be at Agnes's table every evening. There won't be documents to organize or families to visit or filings to counter. I was very still. There won't be a crisis keeping us in the same room, Clara said. No, he said. And I need to know... She stopped. She started again. I need to know that what's between us isn't the crisis. That it isn't about Connolly or the case, or the fact that we've been fighting the same fight for 3 months. She looked at him directly. Because that kind of thing feels like love when you're in it. And sometimes it is. And sometimes when the fight ends, you find out it was only the fight. Nate was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup once. He set it down. The first time I saw you, he said, you were standing outside the dry goods store watching me give Harold 2 more weeks. And I rode away thinking... He stopped. What? She said. Thinking that whoever that woman was, she was watching the situation the same way I was. Not feeling sorry for Harold. Not judging anyone. Just seeing it clearly. He paused. I have been around a lot of people in my life who see what they want to see. You see what's there. Clara looked at him. That was before Connolly, he said. Before the documents and the families and all of it. That was September, Clara, before any of this started. He held her gaze. So no, it's not the crisis. The crisis just gave us somewhere to put the time. She felt the last held breath in her chest release. I'm going to write to Cincinnati, she said. He went very still. I'm going to write and tell them I'm declining, she said. Not because of you. Not only because of you. She held his gaze. Because I came here to save enough money to go back to something that didn't exist anymore. And somewhere between the wagon wheel and the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, I stopped being a woman who was leaving and started being a woman who was here. She paused. I want to be here. I want to finish this school year and start another one. I want to be the person Thomas looks back on someday when he thinks about who believed he was worth believing in. Nate's jaw worked once. And I want... She stopped. She took a breath. I want to find out what this is. Between us. Without the emergency. Without the file on the table. She met his eyes. If you still want that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then Nathaniel Carter, who had spent 11 years rebuilding everything alone and had gotten very good at not asking for things he wasn't sure he could have said simply, I have always wanted that. She wrote the Cincinnati letter the next morning. It took less time to write than she had expected. The words were simple and certain, and she did not revise them. She sealed the envelope and gave it to the stage writer at 8 in the morning and watched it disappear down the road toward Cheyenne, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than relief. Like standing on ground that had been tested and held. February brought the federal ruling. It came on a Tuesday, plain and formal, in its official envelope addressed to Judge Harlan, with a copy forwarded to the Harlan Creek Sheriff's Office. Clara and Nate read it together at Agnes's table, while Agnes stood at the stove with her back turned in the specific posture of a woman who already knew the answer and was giving them the moment. Daniel Connolly and Territorial Land Resources were found to have engaged in systematic document fraud, unauthorized property entry, and coordinated legal harassment across 14 Wyoming families. Connolly's operating authority in Wyoming Territory was permanently revoked. Restitution to affected families was ordered. The 2 families who had settled the Becketts and 1 other were included in the restitution order. Criminal charges were referred to the federal district attorney. 12 families got to keep their land. Clara read the last paragraph twice. She folded the document. She set it down. She looked at the table. It's done, she said. Nate put his hand over hers on the table. Just that. His hand warm and certain over hers. It's done, he said. Agnes turned from the stove. She looked at the 2 of them and at the document on the table. She set down her spoon. She came to the table and she picked up the ruling and she read it, all of it, carefully, the way she read everything. Then she set it down and looked at Clara. "Well," Agnes said, "I suppose you'll be needing a larger room." Clara looked at her. Agnes was already moving back toward the stove. "Spring planting to think about," she said in the voice she used when the conversation was over, because everything that needed to be said had been. "And the school board meets in March. Someone should probably talk to them about extending the term." The town celebrated on a Saturday. Not formally, no speeches, no decorations. Just families appearing at the Grange Hall, in the way that frontier people appear when something has gone right after a long time of things going wrong with food and noise, and the particular ease of people who have been carrying a weight and set it down. Margaret Morrison brought 3 pies. Henry Steele brought his fiddle. Harold Haller shook Clara's hand for so long that his wife finally patted his arm and suggested he let the woman breathe. Thomas Carter sat beside Clara for most of the evening, close enough that his shoulder touched her arm, eating pie with the focused satisfaction of a boy who had decided something privately and was content with his decision. At some point in the middle of the evening, Nate appeared at her side. They stood together at the edge of the hall, watching the room, the families, the children, the fiddle starting up in the corner where Henry Steele had found 3 other willing musicians. "Harold told me something this afternoon," Nate said. "What?" "He said when you came to town he thought you'd be gone in a month." He paused. "He said he wants to apologize for thinking that." "He doesn't need to apologize," Clara said. "I told him that," Nate said. "He said he needs to anyway. You'll be getting a very long handshake from him sometime next week." Clara smiled. She looked at the room. She looked at Rosie Greer dragging her father onto the open floor where people were beginning to dance. She looked at Thomas, who had acquired a second piece of pie from somewhere and was eating it with great concentration. "I was going to be gone in a month," she said. "I know," Nate said. "I had a plan," she said. "You had a plan," he agreed. "It was a good plan," she said, "at the time." "What changed it?" he said, not like he didn't know, like he wanted to hear her say it. She turned and looked at him. His face in the warm light of the hall, the jaw, the dark eyes, the particular expression he wore when he was completely present, which was different from his ordinary face. The way a house with the lights on is different from the same house in the dark. "You repaired my wagon wheel," she said, "and didn't ask for anything in return, and I couldn't figure out why." "You figured it out eventually," he said. "I did," she said. "It took me longer than it should have." "It took exactly the right amount of time," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Across the room, Henry Steele's fiddle found its tempo, and someone cleared the center of the floor, and the dancing began, the honest, unself-conscious dancing of people celebrating something real, without performance, without pretense. Just the pure, uncomplicated joy of a hard thing being over. "Will you dance with me?" Nate said. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Wyoming Territory in the summer of 1887 with a train ticket pressed against her chest and a plan to be somewhere else by spring, who had never intended to stay, who had specifically decided not to feel anything, who had kept her account book like a compass and her departure like a fixed point to navigate toward, looked at Nathaniel Carter and said, "Yes." He took her hand. They danced, and Thomas Carter, eating his second piece of pie in the corner, watched his uncle and his teacher on the open floor, and the thing that had been working in the corner of his mouth all evening finally got all the way out. He smiled. Wide and unguarded and completely certain, the way children smile when the world has arranged itself into the shape they were hoping for. March came with the first real warmth, tentative and deliberate, the way good things come after hard winters. The school board met and extended the term. Clara signed her contract for the following year. The Carter North fence was repaired properly this time with new posts and good wire and cord overseeing every section. The North herd was moved to the spring pasture ahead of schedule for the first time in 3 years. Agnes said nothing about any of this. Agnes simply continued to make coffee and read her books and look out her window at the territory she had lived in for 40 years, with the expression of a woman who had seen enough of life to know that the best outcomes were always the ones that arrived sideways in the middle of something you hadn't planned. One evening in late March, Clara stood on the small porch outside Agnes's house and looked at the land, at the enormous Wyoming sky, going amber at the edges, at the distance that had once made her feel lost, and now simply felt like space. The good kind of space, the kind that lets things breathe. She heard boots on the step behind her. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Nate stood beside her and looked at the same sky. "The south pasture's ready for the spring market," he said. "Good," she said. "Best numbers in 3 years," he said. "I know," she said. "Cord told me." "Of course he did," Nate said. They stood in the quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out something small, a ring plain and gold, the kind of ring a working man buys because it is honest rather than because it is impressive. He held it in his palm and looked at it and then looked at her. "I spent 11 years fighting to keep this land," he said, "and I would do it again. But I need you to know." He stopped. He started again the way he always did when something mattered enough to be said right. "I need you to know that the land is not the point. The land is where I live. You are what I'm living for." Clara looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about Missouri and the train and the plan that had dissolved somewhere between a broken wagon wheel and a federal courthouse. She thought about her father, who had taught her that numbers don't lie, and she thought about all the things that weren't numbers and didn't lie either. She took the ring. She put it on. She looked at Nate Carter, and she said without hesitation, without qualification, with the full and complete weight of everything she had learned in Wyoming, about what it meant to want something and stay. "I didn't come to the Wild West looking for a home," she said. "I came here running from everything I'd lost. But somewhere along the way, the running stopped. And when I looked up..." She held his gaze. "You were there. You were already there." He took her hand. He held it the way he held everything he intended to keep steady, certain, and with the particular care of a man who knew exactly what things cost, and had decided she was worth every price. The Wyoming sky went amber, and then gold, and then the deep, enormous blue of a territory that had been here long before either of them, and would be here long after, indifferent and magnificent and vast. But for Nathaniel Carter and Clara Whitmore, standing on that porch in the last light of a March evening, the vastness was not lonely anymore. She had come to the Wild West planning to leave. She had found instead the one thing no plan had ever prepared her for: a man who repaired broken things, not because he was asked, but because he had decided what kind of person he wanted to be. A boy who watched the door every afternoon and never once doubted the person coming through it. A town that had fought for itself and won. And a life that was harder than anything she had imagined in Missouri, and more real and more hers than anything she had ever planned. She had not come west looking for home. But home, it turned out, had been waiting for her anyway. And this time Clara Whitmore was not leaving.